Weakness rarely announces itself honestly. More often, it is assigned. It is projected onto silence, placed gently onto aging shoulders, and repeated so often that it begins to sound like fact. In families, especially, weakness can be mistaken for kindness, patience, or restraint until no one remembers when the assumption first appeared. This is how strength is quietly rewritten, not through evidence, but through convenience. Arthur Caldwell lived inside routines that had outlasted most people's attention. His mornings began the same way they had for decades, with documents reviewed carefully, dates checked twice, and small details handled with deliberate calm. Paperwork was never rushed. It was aligned, categorized, and completed with the same care he once applied to raising a family and building a life that valued order over noise. Nothing about his habits suggested confusion or decline. Yet to those watching only the surface, his pace looked slow, and his silence felt empty. To his daughter, Elaine, the difference between them felt stark. Her world rewarded speed. Decisions were praised when they were immediate and visible. Confidence was measured by how quickly someone spoke and how forcefully they moved forward. In that environment, her father's patience seemed misplaced. His pauses felt unnecessary. His silence appeared outdated. Elaine did not question her interpretation because it fit neatly into the story she told herself about progress and control. She believed strength should look decisive, not reflective. The family gatherings offered a perfect stage for this quiet misjudgment. No harsh words were exchanged. No open disrespect took shape. Instead, tone did the work. Questions were redirected. Decisions were finalized before Arthur could weigh in. Concern arrived preemptively, wrapped in smiles that made everything sound reasonable. Elaine spoke about helping him, about easing his responsibilities, about protecting him from stress. Each statement sounded caring, but together they built a narrative that excluded him without ever challenging him directly. Arthur did not resist. He did not raise his voice or attempt to reclaim space. He did not defend his competence or correct assumptions. His response remained consistent with the man he had always been. Silence, to him, was not submission. It was familiarity. He had learned long ago that not every misunderstanding deserved energy, and not every moment required explanation. He trusted time more than confrontation, and process more than persuasion. Elaine mistook that silence for acceptance. Each unchallenged assumption reinforced the next, until restraint was interpreted as fragility. His careful pace became proof of weakness. His refusal to compete for attention was labeled disengagement. Concern replaced respect, and omission replaced dialogue. The absence of protest made the narrative feel accurate. In her mind, she was stepping in where he could no longer stand. Throughout these moments, the household remained calm. Laughter filled the spaces where questions might have lived. Smiles smoothed over the discomfort of shifting roles. No one screamed. No one accused. Nothing appeared broken. That calmness made the transformation invisible. When disrespect hides behind politeness, it rarely feels urgent enough to address. The grandson, Thomas, watched all of this without being invited into it. He sat quietly, often unnoticed, absorbing the room in ways adults assumed children could not. He observed how his grandfather's presence diminished without explanation. He noticed how decisions moved around Arthur rather than through him. These observations did not arrive as conclusions. They settled slowly, forming impressions that felt heavier than words. Thomas saw the contrast between what was said and what was done. While adults spoke about decline, Arthur continued his routines without error. Documents were handled correctly. Schedules were maintained. Responsibilities were met without reminder. The man described as weakening appeared to be the most prepared person in the room. This contradiction did not confuse Thomas. It unsettled him. No one explained these shifts to the child because no one believed explanation was necessary. Adults assumed he would remember laughter, not omission. They believed he would forget silence. They did not consider that children often notice what adults normalize. Thomas noticed that silence was being interpreted, not understood. Arthur's life continued with the same quiet consistency. He did not seek reassurance or validation. He did not challenge Elaine's growing authority. The strength he carried did not live in arguments or visibility. It lived in preparation, in timing, in systems built long before they were needed. That strength did not require acknowledgement to exist. It waited patiently, unbothered by misinterpretation. Elaine remained confident in her role. Her concern felt justified. Her certainty felt earned. She believed she was compensating for decline, not creating it. Silence confirmed her assumptions. Each day that passed without objection strengthened her belief that she was right. She did not recognize how easily strength can be overlooked when it refuses to perform. Thomas felt something shift inside him. He could not name it, but he sensed that what the room agreed upon was incomplete. The calmness felt rehearsed. The smiles felt protective rather than warm. He began to understand that silence could mean many things, and weakness might be the least accurate interpretation of all. As routines continued and evenings ended without incident, nothing appeared to change. The assumption of weakness settled comfortably into the family's rhythm. Yet Thomas looked at his grandfather and saw something else entirely. What others dismissed as fading looked to him like restraint, carefully chosen and patiently held. And in that quiet realization, a new understanding began to form, one that would not fade with time. Children are often underestimated not because they lack understanding, but because adults mistake silence for emptiness. Thomas existed in that overlooked space, where presence was tolerated but insight was dismissed. The adults around him believed nuance belonged to experience, and experience belonged to age. They assumed that whatever unfolded quietly around the edges of conversation would dissolve before it reached his awareness. What they did not realize was that Thomas was not listening for explanations. He was watching patterns. No one ever sat him down to clarify what was happening with his grandfather. There were no careful reassurances, no softened narratives, no attempts to frame the changes taking place. The adults simply moved forward, confident that children absorbed only tone and surface emotion. In that absence of explanation, Thomas learned something more enduring. He learned to observe without instruction, to notice without permission, and to remember without being asked. Arthur's withdrawal was subtle enough to pass unnoticed by most. He spoke less, not because he had less to say, but because the room had already decided it would move on without him. Elaine's confidence expanded into that space. She took the lead naturally, filling silences with decisions and schedules. Each step forward she took felt justified by the quiet that preceded it. The less Arthur asserted himself, the more she believed she was compensating for something lost. Thomas noticed the rhythm of these moments. He saw how his grandfather remained composed, how routines continued uninterrupted, how paperwork was still completed with precision. There were no complaints, no requests for recognition, and no signs of resentment. Arthur did not ask to be heard, and no one thought to listen. Silence settled in, steady and unremarkable, and because it caused no disruption, it was ignored. The child watched how easily silence could be rewritten. Adults spoke around it, over it, and through it, assigning meaning without ever checking for accuracy. They assumed Arthur's calm signaled agreement. They assumed his patience meant surrender. Thomas sensed that these assumptions were convenient rather than true. Something about the way his grandfather moved through his days suggested intention, not absence. Silence became instructional without meaning to be. Arthur never attempted to teach Thomas a lesson. He never explained restraint or patience. He simply lived it. The child absorbed those lessons not as rules, but as examples. He learned that presence did not require volume. He learned that dignity could exist without acknowledgement. These lessons settled quietly, forming a foundation that felt steady even when the environment shifted. Elaine continued operating from certainty. Her belief in her father's weakness hardened with each unchallenged moment. She did not notice how often she spoke for him or how quickly she redirected attention. Her confidence was reinforced by the lack of resistance. To her, silence confirmed the narrative she had already accepted. She believed she was protecting him, unaware that protection can sometimes become erasure. Thomas felt the misalignment grow. It did not arrive as fear or anger. It arrived as unease. Something felt off in ways he could not yet articulate. The household remained peaceful, but peace did not feel complete. The smiles felt practiced. The concern felt procedural. No one begged for attention. No one expressed hurt. And yet, the absence of emotional display did not equate to harmony. Arthur's routines continued to anchor the space. He organized documents with the same care he always had. He honored commitments quietly. He moved through his days with an ease that suggested comfort rather than confusion. Thomas noticed that the man others viewed as fading was often the most consistent presence in the room. This contradiction stayed with him. Adults assumed Thomas would forget these details. They believed memory required drama to survive. They did not consider that children often remember what adults normalize. Thomas remembered the way conversations shifted when his grandfather entered the room. He remembered how decisions were made without pause. He remembered how silence was filled by others before it could speak for itself. No one expected Thomas to understand restraint. They did not realize he was learning it. He watched how his grandfather never begged to be included and never demanded acknowledgement. He saw how dignity was maintained through acceptance rather than resistance. These observations did not make him bitter. They made him attentive. As time passed, Thomas began to recognize silence as a choice rather than a condition. He understood that not all quietness was imposed. Some of it was deliberate, shaped by patience and timing. This realization did not come with judgment toward Elaine. It came with clarity. He saw how easily strength could be overlooked when it did not conform to visible expectations. Arthur never corrected these perceptions. He did not step in to reshape the narrative forming around him. His silence held steady, unchanged by interpretation. Thomas understood that this silence was not weakness bending under pressure. It was restraint holding its ground. By the end of those ordinary days, nothing dramatic had occurred. The household remained calm. Roles continued to shift quietly. Yet Thomas carried something new with him. He began to see that silence could be intentional, and patience could be powerful. What others dismissed as submission began to look, to him, like choice. And in that quiet understanding, a deeper awareness took root, one that would guide how he interpreted strength for the rest of his life. Time has a way of smoothing sharp edges while quietly reinforcing beliefs that were never examined closely. As years passed, Thomas moved from childhood into adolescence, carrying with him the quiet observations he had never spoken aloud. Life continued in predictable rhythms, and with each repetition, assumptions settled deeper into place. What once felt like a temporary adjustment became accepted truth, not because it was proven, but because it went unchallenged. Elaine's belief in her father's weakness matured alongside her growing authority. The more responsibility she assumed, the more convinced she became that it was necessary. Her certainty no longer required justification. It was supported by habit, reinforced by time, and protected by the absence of resistance. Arthur's silence, steady and unchanged, was now interpreted as confirmation rather than restraint. The story she told herself no longer felt like an interpretation. It felt like fact. Arthur's physical presence did change, though not in the ways people discussed openly. Age touched him gently, softening movements without disturbing intention. He walked more slowly, rested more often, and spoke less frequently. Yet beneath those visible shifts, the systems he had built remained intact. Documents were still maintained. Schedules were still honored. Plans continued unfolding quietly, untouched by assumptions forming around him. His preparation did not diminish with time. It simply required less visibility. Family routines continued without interruption. Gatherings felt familiar, comfortable, and emotionally neutral. No one revisited earlier moments or questioned how roles had shifted. Elaine's leadership was now expected. Arthur's quiet presence was treated as background rather than contribution. Nothing appeared broken, which made reflection feel unnecessary. Comfort replaced curiosity, and certainty replaced understanding. Thomas noticed how easily this certainty extended beyond his family. As he grew older, He began to see the same patterns repeated in classrooms, offices, and public spaces. Quiet individuals were overlooked. Slowness was equated with limitation. Authority gravitated toward those who spoke first and loudest. Strength was assigned based on visibility, rather than substance. These observations did not arrive dramatically. They accumulated, forming a quiet awareness that shaped how he interpreted the world. He noticed that dismissal often wore polite expressions. Smiles softened exclusion. Concern masked control. There was rarely confrontation. Instead, there was assumption. Silence was interpreted without being questioned. Thomas recognized this pattern because he had watched it unfold at home. What others accepted as natural, he understood as constructed. Arthur never interrupted this progression. He did not correct misconceptions or reclaim space. His days remained structured by the same quiet discipline. He handled paperwork carefully, kept records organized, and maintained commitments that no one else noticed anymore. His strength continued operating beneath the surface, indifferent to recognition. The absence of acknowledgement did not alter his process. As time passed, Thomas's reaction shifted into observation. He learned not to respond immediately to injustice or misunderstanding. He learned to watch and wait, not because he was afraid, but because he understood how systems protected themselves against early resistance. He saw how acting too soon often reinforced the very structures he questioned. Patience became a form of clarity. Elaine remained unaware of the long arc forming beneath her certainty. Her confidence felt earned, reinforced by years of smooth functioning. She did not recognize how much of that stability rested on foundations laid long before she assumed control. The systems Arthur maintained continued supporting outcomes she believed she had orchestrated herself. She mistook inherited order for personal authority. Thomas began to understand the long game without naming it. He recognized that timing mattered more than volume. Observation mattered more than reaction. Silence, when chosen deliberately, could hold more power than immediate confrontation. These lessons did not harden him. They softened his perspective. He learned to approach misunderstanding with patience rather than resentment. Arthur's physical presence continued to fade gently into the background of family life, but his influence remained embedded in structure. The systems he built did not announce themselves. They simply functioned. Thomas noticed that nothing truly fell apart in Arthur's absence from decision-making spaces. Instead, things continued because of what had already been prepared. This realization brought Thomas a sense of calm rather than urgency. He did not feel compelled to correct every misjudgment or expose every assumption. He trusted that clarity often arrived through time rather than argument. The long game did not require explanation. It required consistency. As Thomas reflected on these patterns, he recognized that the family's interpretation of Arthur had less to do with age and more to do with control. Silence threatened authority because it could not be easily managed. Quiet presence disrupted narratives built on visibility. Arthur's restraint was not a surrender to age. It was a refusal to compete on terms that misunderstood strength. By the time Thomas reached adulthood, he no longer questioned what he had observed. The pattern was clear. Strength had been misdefined, not diminished. Time had not revealed weakness. It had revealed how easily people mistake restraint for decline when it challenges their need for control. The realization settled deeply within him. What others attributed to aging, he now understood as deliberate choice. The pattern he noticed was not tied to years lived, but to how authority responded when it could not provoke reaction. And in that understanding, Thomas recognized that the long game had been unfolding quietly all along, guided by patience rather than urgency. Thomas did not discover his grandfather's strength through a dramatic revelation or a spoken confession. It surfaced quietly, the way truth often does, through systems that had been functioning without applause for years. What began as simple curiosity turned into recognition when Thomas encountered the careful order that existed beneath Arthur's calm exterior. It was not hidden exactly. It had simply never been announced. The discovery happened gradually, through proximity rather than intention. Thomas found himself spending more time in the spaces Arthur occupied without comment. Drawers held neatly labeled folders. Files were organized by purpose and timeline. Financial records were current, balanced, and forward-looking. Nothing was chaotic. Nothing suggested neglect or confusion. Each document reflected foresight rather than reaction. This was not the work of a man fading. It was the work of someone who had been planning patiently for years. What struck Thomas most was the absence of explanation. Arthur did not draw attention to any of it. There were no guiding words, no emotional framing, no attempt to correct the narrative that had formed around him. The systems spoke for themselves. They carried intention without sound, meaning without instruction. Thomas realized that his grandfather had not been waiting for recognition. He had been preparing for continuity. Financial order revealed a depth of care that extended far beyond the present moment. Accounts were structured with foresight, anticipating needs not yet visible. Decisions had been made long before they were required. Each record suggested an understanding of timing that favored stability over immediacy. Arthur had not been reacting to circumstances. He had been shaping outcomes quietly, trusting systems to do the work when the moment arrived. Paperwork became a language Thomas learned to read. It told a story of responsibility exercised without urgency. There was no evidence of panic or haste. Everything had been arranged deliberately, with patience that did not demand acknowledgement. The silence surrounding these preparations was not accidental. It was chosen. Arthur had allowed others to believe what they wished, because the work itself did not require belief to function. Thomas felt a shift within himself as he absorbed this understanding. The assumptions he had witnessed now appeared fragile. The belief in Arthur's weakness did not withstand evidence. It had been built on perception rather than proof. Strength, Thomas realized, did not always announce itself through action others could see. Sometimes it lived inside preparation, waiting quietly for the right moment. Arthur's silence remained intact even as this truth became clearer. He did not change his behavior. He did not begin asserting himself or reclaiming authority. The systems continued operating as they always had. Timing remained central. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was corrected prematurely. Thomas understood that revealing strength too early would serve no purpose. The work had already been done. This realization did not bring Thomas a sense of triumph. It brought calm. He felt closer to his grandfather not through words, but through understanding. There was no resentment toward Elaine, no desire to expose misjudgment. The discovery inspired patience rather than confrontation. Thomas recognized that forcing acknowledgement would only undermine the dignity Arthur had preserved. The emotional weight of this understanding settled gently. Thomas felt gratitude rather than urgency. He saw how easily people confuse quiet preparation with absence, and how often systems are mistaken for passivity. Arthur's life had been guided by a belief that responsibility did not need performance. It required consistency. Each record Thomas reviewed reinforced this lesson. Long-term planning revealed trust in time rather than control over people. Documentation served as protection, not leverage. Everything had been arranged to function independently of recognition. Arthur had prepared for outcomes rather than arguments, trusting that clarity would arrive when it was needed. Thomas noticed how these systems intersected seamlessly with the present. Family stability, financial security, and orderly transitions all rested on foundations laid long before Elaine assumed authority. What she perceived as competence was supported quietly by structures she did not recognize. Arthur's preparation did not compete with her confidence. It supported it without requiring gratitude. The silence surrounding these discoveries felt intentional. Arthur never corrected misconceptions because he did not need to. The systems would speak when the time was right. Thomas began to understand that restraint was not weakness delaying action. It was strength honoring timing. This understanding deepened Thomas's empathy. He saw how easily dignity could be eroded by assumption, and how grace could persist without acknowledgement. Arthur had chosen acceptance over correction, patience over defense. His strength had been exercised long before it was visible. As Thomas stepped back from the records, he felt a sense of reverence rather than surprise. The discovery did not change how he saw his grandfather. It clarified what he had already sensed. What others dismissed as decline was, in truth, foresight patiently waiting. One record, in particular, lingered in Thomas's mind. It connected decisions made years earlier to circumstances unfolding now with quiet precision. The timing was exact, the preparation unmistakable. It proved that Arthur had anticipated outcomes long ago, not out of fear, but out of care. And in that realization, Thomas understood that true strength does not announce itself. It endures, waits, and reveals itself only when it is needed most. Heading 5. Confidence built on misreading silence. Word count, 950 words. Elaine's confidence no longer felt provisional. It had settled into permanence, shaped by years of unchallenged authority and reinforced by the quiet that surrounded it. She no longer paused to reassess her assumptions about her father. The story she believed had become self-sustaining, fed by routine, and affirmed by the absence of resistance. Silence, to her, had stopped being a signal worth examining. It had become proof. She moved through decisions with ease, her tone calm, her manner composed. Smiles accompanied instructions. Concerns softened directives. Everything sounded reasonable, measured, and caring. Nothing suggested control. Yet beneath the warmth, certainty had hardened. Elaine believed she understood the situation completely. Her father's quiet presence no longer registered as participation. It was treated as background, something stable but irrelevant, like furniture that had always been there and no longer required attention. Authority, once assumed, has a way of protecting itself. Elaine did not consciously exclude Arthur. She simply stopped accounting for him. His preferences were anticipated without being asked. His opinions were summarized without consultation. Each omission felt efficient rather than dismissive. Over time, invisibility replaced irrelevance, and irrelevance became justification. If he had something important to add, she believed he would speak. His silence confirmed her certainty. Arthur remained unchanged. He did not push back against the narrowing space. He did not attempt to reclaim relevance through performance or insistence. His acceptance was quiet, steady, and easily misunderstood. He continued honoring routines, maintaining records, and fulfilling responsibilities that no one noticed anymore. The absence of acknowledgement did not alter his process. He trusted what had already been put in place. Thomas watched this dynamic deepen. As he grew older, he became more aware of how invisibility was assigned rather than earned. He noticed how authority often depended on forgetting, on the gradual erasure of context and contribution. The louder someone's confidence became, the less they seemed to question its foundation. Elaine's certainty rested on years of assumptions that had never been tested. Smiles continued to smooth interactions. Concern continued to sound compassionate. Nothing felt openly wrong. That was what made it effective. When authority is polite, it rarely attracts scrutiny. Thomas sensed that the household's calm was not the result of harmony, but of unresolved imbalance. Silence had been repurposed into consent without ever being confirmed. Arthur's systems, however, did not depend on perception. They continued responding quietly, unaffected by how he was viewed. Financial structures adjusted as intended. Records remained current. Long-term plans moved forward with precision. These systems did not announce their presence. They simply functioned, carrying the weight of decisions made long ago. What had been ignored was not gone. It was active. Elaine did not notice these shifts because they required no intervention. Stability appeared effortless, reinforcing her belief that she was managing everything well. She mistook inherited order for personal control. The smoother things ran, the more convinced she became that her authority was complete. She did not realize that systems often work best when those benefiting from them are unaware of their complexity. Thomas understood this difference. He saw how easily confidence could be built on forgetting rather than understanding. He noticed how people in positions of authority often depended on others remaining quiet. Silence made systems invisible. Invisibility made power feel natural. The absence of challenge was mistaken for validation. No one expected Thomas to see this. He remained unnoticed, moving through family life without attracting attention. That invisibility allowed him to observe freely. He felt no urgency to correct or confront. He understood that premature exposure would only strengthen resistance. The long game required patience, not reaction. Arthur's past had not been erased. It had been ignored. The structures he created continued shaping outcomes without acknowledgement. His influence persisted not through presence, but through preparation. Thomas recognized that forgetting was not accidental. It was necessary for the illusion of independent authority to survive. Elaine's confidence grew heavier, less flexible. It no longer adapted. It assumed. She did not feel cruel or careless. She felt certain. That certainty insulated her from doubt. She believed silence meant agreement and invisibility meant irrelevance. She did not see how much her position relied on those beliefs remaining unexamined. Thomas felt a quiet resolve take shape. He did not feel anger toward his mother, nor did he feel urgency to expose her misunderstanding. What he felt was clarity. He saw how fragile authority could be when built on omission. He understood that systems remember even when people forget. Timing, not confrontation, would determine when truth surfaced. The household remained calm. Smiles continued. Concern stayed gentle. Nothing dramatic occurred. Yet beneath that surface, processes were aligning, responding exactly as designed. Thomas understood that forgetting was not harmless. It was the system's weakness. Silence had been misread as absence, but it was presence waiting for its moment. Waiting is often misunderstood as hesitation, but in truth, it can be the clearest expression of strength. Thomas had learned this not through instruction, but through years of watching how patience shaped outcomes without announcing itself. He understood that acting too early would only protect the false authority that had grown comfortable in silence. Intervention, when mistimed, would have validated assumptions rather than challenged them. So he waited, not out of fear, but out of respect for timing. This waiting was intentional. Thomas did not drift passively through events. He observed carefully, noting how systems responded to pressure and how people reacted when their certainty went unquestioned. He recognized that authority built on assumption depended on speed. It required quick reactions and immediate compliance. Patience disrupted that rhythm. Silence, when sustained without strain, allowed patterns to reveal themselves fully. Elaine continued moving forward with confidence, unaware of the quiet recalibration taking place beneath her certainty. She believed control was secure because nothing challenged it openly. The absence of resistance felt like confirmation. Yet Thomas knew that early confrontation would only reinforce her belief that she was necessary. Acting too soon would have allowed her to frame resistance as misunderstanding rather than correction. Arthur's influence remained steady, embedded in systems that did not require advocacy. His preparation had anticipated this phase, even if no one else recognized it. Documents, schedules, and structures continued aligning quietly. Nothing dramatic occurred. No warnings were issued. The long game matured without announcement, unfolding at its own pace, independent of perception. Thomas felt the weight of restraint, but it did not burden him. It grounded him. He understood that silence did not weaken his position. It strengthened it. By refusing to rush, he allowed the full shape of the situation to become visible. Every overlooked detail added clarity. Every unchallenged assumption deepened the contrast between appearance and reality. There were moments when impatience tempted him. He could see how easily misunderstandings could be corrected with a single explanation. Yet he resisted that impulse. Explanation would have centered authority back onto those who had misread silence. Correction would have invited defensiveness. Thomas chose patience because it honored the integrity of what had already been prepared. Arthur never signaled approval or urgency. His calm remained unchanged, reinforcing the lesson without words. He trusted timing in a way that did not seek reassurance. The systems he built were designed to respond precisely when needed, not when demanded. Thomas recognized this trust as a form of quiet courage. Waiting allowed Thomas to see how strength often remains invisible until activated. It does not demand recognition or validation. It simply exists, ready to function when conditions align. This understanding softened his perspective. He did not feel compelled to prove anything. He felt content knowing that preparation does not require audience. Elaine's authority, built on misreading silence, continued operating smoothly on the surface. Yet subtle shifts began occurring beyond her awareness. Processes responded automatically. Adjustments took place without announcement. The absence of disruption made these changes easy to overlook. Stability appeared unchanged, even as its foundation quietly asserted itself. Thomas sensed the moment drawing closer, not through signs or signals, but through alignment. Timing became less abstract and more tangible. He understood that the correct moment would not arrive with urgency or drama. It would arrive naturally, as outcomes intersected with preparation. The emotional texture of this waiting was gentle rather than tense. Thomas did not harbor resentment or anticipation of triumph. His patience was rooted in acceptance. He accepted that misunderstanding had occurred. He accepted that correction required grace rather than force. This acceptance made waiting feel purposeful rather than passive. Arthur's example remained central. He had waited without bitterness, allowing systems to carry intention forward. His silence had never been an appeal for attention. It had been an expression of trust in what had been built. Thomas honored that trust by maintaining restraint. As time passed, the weight of preparation became undeniable. The systems Arthur created continued guiding outcomes with quiet precision. Nothing needed to be said. Nothing needed to be claimed. The absence of victory speeches or acknowledgement preserved dignity. Strength did not announce itself, because it did not need to. Thomas felt a calm certainty settle within him. He knew that when the moment arrived, it would not feel like revelation. It would feel like inevitability. Preparation would intersect with circumstance naturally, without spectacle. That understanding allowed him to remain still, attentive, and patient. The long game had never been about proving anyone wrong. It had been about allowing truth to surface without force. Thomas trusted that process. He trusted timing. He trusted silence to hold its ground. And then, without announcement, the moment arrived. The outcome did not arrive with tension or announcement. It moved through established channels the way truth often does, when it no longer needs advocacy. Information reached the places it had been designed to reach, carried by systems that required no emotion to function. Nothing dramatic unfolded. No voices rose. No one was summoned to explain themselves. The shift happened quietly, with the same calm efficiency that had defined Arthur's preparation all along. Thomas observed the change, without satisfaction or urgency. He recognized it not by reaction, but by alignment. Procedures responded exactly as they were meant to, following paths laid down long before the present moment demanded them. What unfolded was not correction driven by anger, but adjustment guided by structure. The systems did not ask who was right or wrong. They simply responded to what was documented, complete, and timely. Elaine sensed something altering beneath her certainty, though she could not immediately identify its source. Decisions she once made without resistance now required confirmation. Processes that had flowed around her began moving independently. There was no accusation attached to these changes. No one suggested error. The absence of confrontation made it difficult to resist or reframe. Authority adjusted not because it was challenged, but because it was no longer necessary in the same way. No apology was demanded. None was offered. The situation did not call for emotional reconciliation or public acknowledgement. What mattered was not how the past was interpreted, but how the present functioned. Arthur's influence reasserted itself not through presence, but through consequence. The systems he had built continued doing what they were designed to do, indifferent to recognition or sentiment. Thomas felt a deep sense of calm as he watched the process unfold. There was no triumph in this moment, no desire to claim credit or witness discomfort. The outcome was clean, precise, and contained. It honored restraint rather than rewarding reaction. This was the resolution Arthur's patience had made possible, one that preserved dignity for everyone involved. Elaine did not collapse under the weight of realization. There was no dramatic reckoning or emotional release. Instead, she experienced a subtle recalibration. Confidence softened into awareness. Certainty gave way to quiet reconsideration. She began to notice how much stability had existed before her leadership, how much she had inherited rather than created. This understanding arrived without shame, carried by the gentleness of systems that corrected without accusation. Arthur remained unchanged throughout it all. He did not step forward to reclaim authority or clarify his role. He did not seek validation or acknowledgement. His silence continued, steady and intact. The outcome did not require his presence. It required only that what he had prepared be allowed to function as intended. The strength he embodied did not need to be seen to be effective. Thomas understood that this was the power of restraint. Consequences delivered through systems carry no cruelty. They do not humiliate or expose. They simply restore balance. This realization filled him with a sense of grace rather than vindication. He felt gratitude for the patience that had shaped this moment and for the absence of harm it allowed. The emotional texture of the household shifted gently. Smiles became less performative. Concern became more attentive. Nothing was spoken aloud, yet understanding began to surface quietly. Elaine did not need to be told. She had misread silence. The systems had already shown her. This form of correction preserved relationship rather than damaging it. Thomas noticed how the absence of drama protected everyone involved. There was no collapse to recover from, no apology to accept or reject. The outcome allowed for acceptance without guilt and awareness without shame. It created space for emotional forgiveness without requiring confession. This was not about proving anyone wrong. It was about allowing truth to settle naturally. Arthur's past was no longer invisible. It was present in the way things worked, in the continuity that remained uninterrupted. His preparation had carried intention forward, bridging misunderstanding without forcing reconciliation. Thomas saw this as the final expression of his grandfather's strength. Not resistance, but endurance. Not correction, but completion. The household adapted to the new equilibrium without comment. Authority redistributed itself quietly. Roles adjusted naturally. Nothing felt forced. The calm that followed was deeper than the calm that preceded it. It carried understanding rather than assumption. This calm did not erase the past, but it no longer depended on forgetting it either. Thomas felt a sense of closure that did not require celebration. He understood that restraint had achieved what confrontation never could. The systems had spoken clearly, and in doing so, they preserved dignity for everyone involved. This was the clean consequence Arthur had trusted in all along. As days passed, the permanence of the change became clear. The adjustments held. The systems continued functioning with the same quiet reliability. There was no reversal, no attempt to reclaim old certainty. The absence of spectacle ensured the outcome endured. Thomas recognized that the system had changed not loudly, but completely. And in that quiet permanence, he understood the true power of patience, preparation, and silence. Arthur never explained himself, not before the changes unfolded, and not after they settled into place. He did not recount sacrifices, list preparations, or clarify intentions. His silence remained intact, unaltered by outcome or recognition. For him, explanation had never been the point. What mattered was that what needed to endure had endured. The systems held. The family remained whole. Dignity stayed untouched. Thomas noticed this first. He saw how his grandfather continued living as he always had, unremarkable in appearance, yet unwavering in principle. There was no satisfaction visible on Arthur's face, no sense of having been proven right. He did not reclaim authority or reference the past. His strength expressed itself through continuity, not conclusion. That quiet consistency taught Thomas more than any explanation ever could. The grandson sought no recognition either. He did not reveal what he had seen or position himself as the one who understood. There was no desire to be acknowledged as patient or perceptive. He understood now that recognition could cheapen what restraint had preserved. The lesson was not meant to elevate him above others. It was meant to shape how he moved forward. Strength, as Thomas came to understand it, had little to do with dominance. It did not rush into rooms or command attention. It prepared. It waited. It trusted timing more than control. Arthur had embodied this form of strength for decades, quietly laying foundations that did not depend on gratitude. The endurance of those foundations proved that restraint was not passive. It was deliberate. Silence revealed itself as more durable than dominance. Loud authority required constant reinforcement. It demanded compliance, attention, and reaction. Arthur's silence required none of that. It held steady under misinterpretation, absorbing assumption without collapsing. It allowed others to define it incorrectly without surrendering its purpose. That durability, Thomas realized, was what made it powerful. Memory played a central role in this understanding. Thomas recognized that forgetting allowed patterns to repeat. Misjudgments survived because no one remembered their origin. By remembering, he had prevented repetition, not through exposure, but through awareness. Memory did not demand confrontation. It demanded responsibility. It shaped how he interpreted silence in others, how he assessed confidence, and how he measured strength. Arthur's life demonstrated that control, without cruelty, was possible. He had never needed to diminish others to secure outcomes. His systems corrected gently, preserving dignity for everyone involved. This approach left no scars. It did not humiliate or shame. It allowed growth without forcing apology. Thomas saw this as grace in its purest form, correction without harm. The emotional forgiveness that followed was quiet but real. Elaine adjusted without being broken. Arthur remained steady without needing validation. Thomas carried the lesson forward without resentment. Acceptance replaced judgment. Guilt softened into understanding. Grace moved freely because no one had demanded payment for past misinterpretation. This was not a story of victory. It was a story of alignment restored. Thomas understood that strength often looks unimpressive from the outside. It does not compete for attention. It does not interrupt. It does not announce its presence. Instead, it invests in preparation, trusts in timing, and allows outcomes to speak for themselves. This understanding changed how he saw the world. He began noticing quiet competence where others saw passivity. He learned to pause before interpreting silence as absence. Arthur's influence would never be recorded in speeches or acknowledgments. It lived in the systems that continued functioning, in the family that remained intact, and in the grandson who carried the lesson forward. That influence did not require memory from everyone. It required memory from someone. Thomas accepted that responsibility without pride. The generational transfer was subtle. There was no formal passing of wisdom, no moment of recognition. The lesson arrived through observation and patience. Thomas understood that this was intentional. Strength that requires explanation risks being misunderstood again. Strength that endures quietly teaches those willing to watch. As Thomas looked ahead, he felt a sense of calm resolve. He did not fear being overlooked. He did not fear being misunderstood. He trusted that preparation would matter more than perception. He accepted that restraint might be misread, and he accepted that clarity often arrived too late to correct narratives. What mattered was not being seen correctly, but building something that could endure misinterpretation. Arthur continued his routines, uncelebrated and unaltered. The systems remained in place. Life moved forward without spectacle. This quiet continuity felt like closure, though nothing had officially ended. The story did not conclude with acknowledgement or apology. It concluded with understanding. Thomas carried that understanding with him. He knew that real strength often looks like patience, that dignity does not require applause, and that restraint, when chosen deliberately, wins without announcing victory. The lesson did not make him feel superior. It made him feel grounded. Strength, he understood now, is often dismissed as weakness, not because it lacks power, but because it refuses performance. And only time, patient and impartial, reveals who is prepared to endure.